My father used to say that land remembers. As a little girl, I thought he meant footprints. I believed the soil somehow held the shape of every boot that crossed it. When I grew older, he explained what he really meant. Land remembers promises. He would kneel beside a row of fresh corn, scoop a handful of dark earth into his weathered palm, and smile. People forget. The land doesn't. Back then, I didn't fully understand. I do now. Every fence post on our family farm carried a story. Every oak tree had watched another generation grow. Every worn path between the barn and the farmhouse had been walked by my grandparents before my father ever inherited the place. To outsiders, it was 200 acres of farmland. To me, it was every birthday, every Christmas, every scraped knee. Every sunrise I watched from the porch while my father drank black coffee and quietly planned another day's work. It wasn't valuable because of what someone could pay for it. It was valuable because it held every piece of the family I loved. My name is Alicia Harper. I'm 48 years old. For most of my life, I believed my older brother Daniel and I wanted the same thing: protect the farm, honor our father, keep our family together. If someone had asked me 5 years ago who I trusted most after Dad, I would have answered without hesitation, my brother. Funny how confidence disappears, not all at once, one memory at a time. Dad wasn't a wealthy man by most standards. The farm barely made enough during difficult years. Some seasons rewarded months of hard work. Others punished us with drought, storms, or falling crop prices. Yet Dad never complained. This place feeds more than our stomachs. He loved saying that. It feeds our character. Looking back, I think he spent far more time growing people than crops. Daniel inherited Dad's talent for machinery. By 14, he could rebuild an old tractor engine with almost no help. I inherited something different. I loved the books, the paperwork, the ledgers. While Dad and Daniel repaired combines in the equipment shed, I often sat beside the kitchen window balancing expenses, organizing receipts, and learning every detail about how the farm survived another season. Dad used to tease us. "I've got one child who understands engines," he'd grin toward Daniel, "and another who understands everything keeping the engines running." Then he'd laugh. "Guess I'm lucky." Those words stayed with me. We weren't competitors, we were partners, or at least I believed we were. When Mom passed away unexpectedly, I was 26, Daniel was 29. The grief nearly destroyed Dad. For months, he walked through the farmhouse as though every room belonged to someone else. Neither Daniel nor I moved away after that. Life changed, responsibilities changed. The farm became more than property. It became the place that kept the three of us standing. Eventually, I married, had a daughter named Emma. Daniel married too. His wife Karen often talked about expanding operations, buying neighboring acreage, modernizing equipment. She had ambitious ideas. Dad always listened politely, then answered the same way. Bigger isn't always better. Karen smiled, but disappointment usually flashed across her face before disappearing again. At the time, I didn't think much about it. Family members don't always agree. That doesn't make anyone dishonest. Years passed. Emma grew older. Dad's hair turned completely silver. The farmhouse slowly collected another generation of photographs. Life felt predictable, comfortable. Then Dad became sick. Not suddenly, quietly. The doctors called it heart failure. Medication helped for a while, but every season seemed to take more strength from him. One autumn evening, after finishing supper, Dad asked Daniel and I to sit with him on the porch. The sunset painted the fields deep shades of gold. For several minutes, nobody spoke. Finally, he broke the silence. "I need you both to promise me something." Daniel nodded immediately. "Anything." Dad looked toward me. "Alicia?" "I promise." He smiled sadly. "Don't answer until you hear it." I laughed softly. "All right." He looked across the fields before speaking again. "I know one day this farm might not stay in the family forever." Neither of us interrupted. I'm realistic. His voice remained calm. Maybe your children won't want this life. He shrugged gently. Maybe farming won't make sense anymore. Another long pause. But until both of you decide together, he looked directly at us, this land stays exactly where it is. Daniel nodded. Of course. Dad continued. No selling because someone pressures you. No selling because someone offers quick money. He rested both hands on his cane. If the day ever comes, he smiled warmly, you decide together. Both of you, not one. I answered first. I understand. Daniel quickly agreed. We both do. Dad seemed relieved. I needed to hear that. That conversation became one of our last truly peaceful evenings together. 6 months later, we buried him beneath the old maple tree overlooking the western pasture, just as he requested. The entire town came, neighbors, church friends, former farmhands, people Dad had quietly helped over decades. During the service, nearly everyone described him the same way, honest, steady, dependable, the kind of man whose word mattered more than any contract. Listening to those stories made me proud. It also made me determined. I would protect everything he spent his life building, not just the farm, his values. After the funeral, Daniel hugged me tightly. We'll get through this. I know. Dad would have wanted us together. I nodded against his shoulder. We always will be. Looking back now, that may have been the last promise we both genuinely believed. The estate settled slowly, nothing unusual. Dad's will divided ownership of the farm equally between Daniel and me, 50% each, exactly as we'd always expected. There were no arguments, no bitterness, no courtroom disputes. The attorney reviewed every document carefully. Everything appeared straightforward. Daniel continued managing most of the daily farm operations. I handled tax records, insurance paperwork, lease agreements for seasonal equipment, just like always. For nearly 2 years, nothing seemed different, until small changes began appearing. Not dramatic changes, subtle ones. Daniel stopped discussing long-term plans. He became strangely protective of financial records. Meetings with surveyors happened without mentioning them to me. Whenever I asked ordinary questions, his answers became shorter. We've got it covered. I'll handle it. Don't worry. The words sounded harmless, helpful even, yet each one quietly moved me farther away from decisions Dad expected us to make together. One Sunday afternoon, I mentioned replacing an old fence along the southern pasture. Daniel barely looked up from his coffee. No point. What do you mean? We'll figure it out later. Figure what out? He shrugged. No reason to spend money yet. The conversation ended there. At the time, I assumed he meant waiting until harvest. Now I know he meant something entirely different. Sometimes betrayal doesn't begin with one enormous lie. Sometimes it begins with ordinary conversations that suddenly become strangely incomplete. I ignored those moments because he was my brother, because we'd buried our father together, because promises made on that porch still echoed inside my heart. I never imagined that while I continued protecting our father's legacy, someone else had already begun selling it away. And I wouldn't discover the truth from my own family. I'd discover it the morning complete strangers drove onto our farm, carrying measuring equipment, boundary stakes, and paperwork claiming I had already agreed to give everything up. The first truck arrived just after 8 on a Wednesday morning. I was standing beside the chicken coop carrying a bucket of feed when I heard tires crunching across the gravel driveway. At first, I assumed it was another delivery. Seed suppliers came and went throughout the year. Equipment mechanics occasionally stopped by without much notice. Nothing about the white pickup seemed unusual until 2 men climbed out carrying tripods, measuring poles, and fluorescent orange boundary stakes. They weren't dressed like farmers. One wore a reflective safety vest, the other unfolded a large rolled map across the hood of the truck. I watched them for several moments before walking across the yard. "Good morning." The older man smiled politely. "Morning. Can I help you?" We're here to complete the boundary survey. I frowned. For what? The property transfer. For a second, I wondered if he'd confused our farm with another one down the road. I'm sorry, I glanced toward the map. What property transfer? He looked surprised. The Harper farm. My stomach tightened. There isn't any property transfer. He exchanged a quick glance with his partner, then looked back at me. Ma'am, we've been hired by the new owners. The words landed so strangely that my mind refused to process them. New owners? Yes. I laughed, not because anything felt funny, because the idea itself seemed ridiculous. I think you're at the wrong farm. The older surveyor hesitated. Is this 418 County Road 12? Yes. The Harper property? Yes. He slowly folded the map. I'm afraid we're in the right place. I stared at him. No. I shook my head. There has to be some mistake. He remained respectful. I understand this may be unexpected. Unexpected? That word barely scratched the surface. I live here. I know. My father owned this farm. I understand. My brother and I inherited it. Another pause. Then perhaps you should contact him. Something inside me turned cold. Daniel. Why would they tell me to call Daniel? I thanked the men as calmly as I could and walked back toward the farmhouse. The moment I stepped inside, I grabbed my cell phone. Daniel answered on the third ring. Hey, there are surveyors here. Silence. Daniel? They're supposed to be. What do you mean they're supposed to be? They're measuring. For what? Another long pause. The sale. Every word sounded slower than the one before it. What sale? The property. I actually laughed, not because I believed him, because the idea itself seemed ridiculous. What are you talking about? I sold it. I couldn't finish. You sold what? The property. My hand tightened around the phone. Our property? Yes. Daniel. My voice barely worked. You can't. It was the best decision. The best decision? The offer was excellent. I leaned against the kitchen counter to steady myself. What offer? $420,000. The room suddenly felt much smaller. You sold Dad's farm? I whispered. For $420,000? It was fair market value. I don't care if they offered $4 million. I finally found my voice. You don't own it by yourself. I handled everything. No, you handled your half. Silence. Then he quietly said something that made my entire body go numb. You signed. I closed my eyes. What? You agreed? I absolutely did not. The paperwork says otherwise. I pushed myself away from the counter. What paperwork? The transfer documents. I never signed transfer documents. They're notarized. I don't care if they're notarized. My heart pounded. I never signed anything. His voice remained strangely calm. Alicia? No, I interrupted. Don't. I know my own signature. You probably forgot. Forgot? Forgot selling the farm where my father was buried? Forgot signing away half the land I'd helped protect my entire life? I felt anger rising faster than grief. I didn't forget. Then I don't know what to tell you. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, I asked the only question that mattered. When? He said 3 months. 3 months. 3 entire months while I continued paying insurance premiums, reviewing tax notices, planning fence repairs. Daniel had already completed a sale I knew nothing about. You lied to me. I didn't lie. You hid it. I was waiting until everything finished. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. You watched me work on paperwork for property you already believed belonged to someone else. It wasn't that simple. No, I answered quietly. It really was. Then I ended the call. I stood in the kitchen staring through the window toward the western pasture. Dad's maple tree stood exactly where we'd buried him. The wind moved gently through the tall grass. Everything outside looked exactly the same. Inside, nothing felt recognizable anymore. Within an hour, relatives started calling. My Aunt Margaret spoke first. "Alicia?" I just heard. "You knew? I thought you both agreed." "No." A long silence followed. "Daniel said you wanted the money." "I never said that." "He told everyone," her voice faded, "that you'd finally accepted selling." By lunchtime, I had spoken with 6 relatives. Every conversation sounded almost identical. "We thought you approved. Daniel said you signed. He told us both of you reached an agreement." One by one, I realized something even more painful than the sale itself. My brother hadn't only sold the farm, he had rewritten the story before anyone asked questions. By evening, I drove to the county records office. I requested copies of every document connected to the transaction. The clerk disappeared into the records room. A few minutes later, she returned carrying a thick folder. She placed it gently on the counter. "Everything filed with the transaction is here." I thanked her and carried the folder to a nearby table. Purchase agreement, property disclosures, transfer paperwork, closing documents. Then I found it. My signature. Or rather, something pretending to be my signature. At first glance, it almost looked convincing. The same looping A, the same long underline beneath my last name, but it wasn't mine. Not even close. The letters leaned differently. The spacing was wrong. Most importantly, I never held that pen. I traced the signature carefully with my eyes. My hands trembled, not because I doubted myself, because I didn't. I knew exactly what I was looking at. Someone had written my name. Someone had claimed I agreed. Someone had stolen far more than land. They had stolen my voice. As I closed the file, one thought echoed louder than every other. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a family disagreement. This was fraud, and somehow I was the only person who seemed to be willing to say that word out loud.
I barely slept that night. The copies of the property records remained spread across my dining room table. Every time I walked past them, my eyes drifted back to the forged signature. It looked close enough to fool someone who had never watched me sign my name, but I had written that signature thousands of times. Checks, tax documents, loan applications, school permission slips for Emma, birthday cards, Christmas gifts. I knew every curve of my own handwriting. That signature belonged to a stranger pretending to be me. Just after sunrise, I called the county recorder's office again. "I'm sorry to bother you." "You aren't." The woman who answered recognized my voice. "I have another question." "Go ahead." "Who notarized these documents?" She searched for a moment, then read a name and commission number from the file. I wrote everything down. "Can I contact the notary?" "You certainly can." "Thank you." My next call was to the notary's office. The receptionist answered politely. When I explained why I was calling, her tone immediately changed. "Please hold." A minute later, the notary herself came to the phone. "My name is Patricia." "Mrs. Harper?" "Yes." "I understand you have questions about a property transfer." "I do." I took a slow breath. "The documents say you witnessed me signing this." Another silence. "I'm looking at the journal now." She sounded confused. "It shows 2 signatures." "I wasn't there." She hesitated. "I honestly don't remember the appointment." "When was it?" She gave me the date. I opened my calendar. That afternoon, I had been 3 counties away attending Emma's college graduation. There were photographs, hotel receipts, restaurant charges, dozens of witnesses. I couldn't have signed anything that day. She grew noticeably quieter. "I think you should speak with an attorney." I planned to. Before ending the call, I thanked her. She sounded shaken. So was I. Around mid-morning, I drove to Daniel's house. Not because I expected honesty, because I wanted to hear him explain everything while looking me in the eyes. Karen answered the door. She smiled at first, then her expression changed. Alicia? Is Daniel home? He doesn't want to fight. I'm not here to fight. She folded her arms. We've already been through this. No, I answered calmly. We haven't. Daniel appeared behind her. It's all right. He stepped onto the porch and quietly closed the front door behind him. What do you want? I held up the copied documents. I want you to explain this signature. He barely glanced at them. You already know. No, I know it isn't mine. His shoulders tightened. It went through legally. That wasn't my question. The closing happened. Still not my question. I stepped closer. Did you watch me sign these papers? He looked away. Alicia, look at me. Slowly, he did. Did you watch me sign them? No. The answer came so quietly I almost missed it. Then why did you tell everyone I agreed? He rubbed the back of his neck. You would have fought it. Of course I would have. It needed to happen. For who? He didn't answer. For Dad? Silence. For me? Nothing. For Emma? Still nothing. For you? Finally, he spoke. You don't understand the pressure. What pressure? The loans. What loans? His eyes widened ever so slightly. Immediately, I knew he'd revealed something unintentionally. You borrowed against the farm. He looked down. My heart sank. You did. Karen stepped outside again. Daniel? He ignored her. Answer me, I said. Did you borrow money without telling me? He sighed heavily. It was temporary. How much? Alicia, how much? He whispered a number. 80,000. I felt dizzy. $80,000? It was for equipment. Equipment we didn't need? We were expanding. He glanced toward the house where Karen stood silently behind the screen door. I understood. Maybe not every detail. Enough. This wasn't Dad's plan. No, Daniel admitted quietly. It wasn't. I looked across the road toward the fields that stretched into the distance. Those same fields where we'd played hide and seek as children. The same road Dad walked every evening checking fences before sunset. Everything looked familiar, except the man standing in front of me. When were you going to tell me? I was hoping you'd understand after the money came. What money? Your share. I stared at him. My share? I set aside $210,000. He actually believed that solved something, as though my half of the money equaled my half of the promise. I shook my head slowly. You think this is about the amount, isn't it? No. Tears filled my eyes. It's about Dad. I pointed toward the distant western pasture. He asked us for one thing. Daniel looked away again. One thing. My voice cracked. We promised him together. For the first time, real regret appeared on his face. Not because he'd been caught, because hearing Dad mentioned out loud made the memory impossible to ignore. I turned to leave. Alicia. I stopped walking, but didn't turn around. I'm sorry. The words floated across the yard. Months earlier, I would have accepted them. Now they sounded incomplete. Sorry without truth is only another way of asking someone to ignore what happened. I got into my truck and drove away. Halfway home, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed a name I hadn't seen in nearly 2 years. William Bennett, Dad's retired attorney. I smiled sadly. Mr. Bennett prepared every legal document Dad ever signed. He officially retired shortly after Dad's funeral. I almost let the call go to voicemail. Instead, I answered. Mr. Bennett? Alicia. His familiar voice sounded warm. I hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all. I've actually been trying to reach you. Something in his tone immediately caught my attention. Is everything all right? A long pause followed. "I'm not certain," he answered carefully, "but while closing my office permanently yesterday," another pause, "I found one of your father's old estate files." I frowned. I thought everything had already been settled. "So did I." His voice became unusually serious. "That's why I think you should come see me." "What did you find?" Another silence. Finally, he answered with a sentence that would change everything. "I found handwritten notes your father never intended anyone to overlook." And suddenly, for the first time since discovering the forged signature, I no longer felt completely alone.
I arrived at William Bennett's office the following morning. The old brick building looked exactly as I remembered. The brass nameplate had already been removed from the front door. Half-packed cardboard boxes lined the reception area. Shelves that once held decades of legal files now stood mostly empty. Retirement had clearly begun, yet something about the office still felt comforting. When my parents needed legal advice, they came here. When Dad bought additional acreage 30 years earlier, Mr. Bennett handled the paperwork. When Mom passed away, he quietly helped Dad revise his estate plan without charging him a dime. Dad trusted very few people outside our family. William Bennett was one of them. He greeted me warmly. "Alicia." He looked older than I remembered. His hair had turned almost completely white, but his handshake remained firm. "I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances." "So am I." He led me into his office. One large banker box sat open beside his desk. Old folders filled with handwritten labels rested neatly inside. "I've been closing files alphabetically," he explained. "When I reached your father's records," he opened a worn brown folder. "I noticed something that shouldn't have been there." He carefully removed a manila envelope. Across the front, written in Dad's unmistakable handwriting, were 4 simple words: "Do not destroy." My throat tightened. Dad's handwriting always leaned slightly to the right, strong, neat, purposeful. Seeing it again felt like hearing his voice. Mr. Bennett slowly opened the envelope. Inside were several documents. None looked familiar. The first item, he slid a folded paper toward me. I unfolded it carefully. At the top, typed in bold letters, were the words, "Family Farm Preservation Agreement." I looked up. "I've never seen this." "You weren't supposed to." "What do you mean?" "Your father asked me to prepare it." He adjusted his glasses. "But he never had both of you sign it." "Why not?" "He said," Mr. Bennett smiled sadly, "he believed his children would keep their promise without needing another contract." A lump formed in my throat. That sounded exactly like Dad. "What did the agreement say?" He pointed toward the second page. I began reading. The language was formal, legal, but one paragraph immediately caught my attention. "No transfer, sale, mortgage, or conveyance of the Harper family farm shall occur unless both owners provide separate written approval executed voluntarily before independent witnesses." I read it again, then a third time. Independent witnesses, separate written approval, both owners. Exactly what Dad had told us on the porch. Mr. Bennett quietly spoke. He wanted protection against pressure. Pressure? He worried that one child might someday face financial hardship. I immediately thought of Daniel's loans. He believed the other should never lose ownership because of decisions made alone. I stared silently at the draft. So he expected this possibility? He hoped it would never happen. Another long pause. But he planned carefully. Mr. Bennett reached back into the envelope. I found something else. This time he handed me several yellow legal pad pages. Every line had been written by Dad himself, not legal language, just personal notes, thoughts, reminders. The first sentence nearly broke my heart. "If Alicia and Daniel ever disagree, neither should be forced." I covered my mouth. The next page continued. "The farm belongs equally to both children. Equal means equal in every decision." My vision blurred. Another note. Money comes and goes. Family land only disappears once. Tears finally spilled down my face. Those weren't legal instructions. They were Father's hopes, his values, his heart. Mr. Bennett quietly handed me a tissue. I suspected you'd want copies. I do. He already made them. He waited until I composed myself before speaking again. There was one final document. He opened another folder. This one concerns ownership. I studied several deeds, property maps, boundary descriptions. Everything looked routine. Then he pointed toward 2 signatures. Notice anything? I leaned closer. The signatures belonged to Dad. Different years, different documents, yet every signature looked remarkably consistent. Then he placed one of the recently filed sale documents beside them. My forged signature stared back from the page. Even without being a handwriting expert, the difference suddenly seemed obvious. The spacing, the slant, the pressure, everything looked wrong. Mr. Bennett folded his hands. I'm not a forensic examiner. No, but after 50 years preparing legal documents, he paused. I've learned to recognize when something deserves closer attention. I looked up slowly. You think it's forged? You think, he answered carefully. Someone should examine it professionally. The room became very quiet. Outside, rain tapped gently against the office windows. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, I asked the question that had haunted me for days. Do you think Dad would have believed this could happen? Mr. Bennett looked toward the framed photograph hanging behind his desk. It showed him and Dad shaking hands after purchasing the Eastern pasture decades earlier. I think your father believed people could be tempted, he smiled sadly. But I don't think he ever believed either of his children would betray the other. Neither did I. That realization hurt more than everything else. Mr. Bennett reached into his desk drawer one final time. He removed a small leather appointment book. He almost forgot. He flipped through several pages before stopping. Here. What is it? My meeting notes. He pointed toward an entry dated just 3 months before Dad passed. The handwriting belonged to Mr. Bennett. Discussed preserving farm. Client repeated twice, never allow one child to sell without the other. He tapped the page gently. I wrote this immediately after our conversation. I looked at the faded ink. Simple words, written years ago, never intended for a courtroom, never intended for anyone except one attorney keeping accurate records. Yet somehow, those forgotten notes carried more truth than every document my brother used to justify selling the farm. Mr. Bennett carefully placed every original document back into the envelope. I'm giving these to you. I looked surprised. Shouldn't you keep them? I'm retiring. He smiled warmly, and I have a feeling they'll be more useful in your hands than in a storage archive. I accepted the envelope carefully. It felt strangely heavy, not because of the paper inside, because it contained something I thought I'd already lost. Proof that my father never changed his mind. Proof that his promise on the porch wasn't just a conversation. It was the principle that guided every legal decision he tried to make. As I stood to leave, Mr. Bennett walked me to the front door. Alicia. Yes, don't confuse how difficult this may become with whether you're right. I nodded slowly. I won't. Driving away, the envelope rested safely on the passenger seat. For the first time since strangers appeared measuring our fences, hope quietly replaced helplessness, because somewhere inside those forgotten papers, my father had reached across the years to defend the legacy he trusted both of his children to protect. I didn't drive home immediately. Instead, I pulled into the parking lot of the small church where my parents had worshipped for nearly 40 years. The sanctuary was empty. Only the groundskeeper worked quietly near the flower beds. I carried the envelope William Bennett had given me and sat on one of the wooden benches beneath a large oak tree. For several minutes, I simply looked at my father's handwriting. Each page reminded me of the man who had raised us, careful, patient, thoughtful. Dad had never believed that love alone protected a family. He believed honesty did, promises did, respect did. The handwritten notes weren't complicated. There were no emotional speeches, no dramatic declarations, just practical reminders from a farmer who understood that people sometimes forgot what mattered when money entered the conversation. One sentence stood out more than all the others. If either child feels pressured, there should be no sale. I read it again, then again. Pressure. I thought about Daniel admitting the loans, $80,000, equipment purchases, expansion plans, Karen's constant desire to grow the business. Dad had seen the possibility years before any of us recognized it. He knew financial pressure could become more dangerous than bad weather. The church bell rang softly in the distance. I folded the papers carefully and placed them back into the envelope. There was only one person I needed to call. Rebecca Lawson, attorney at law. The receptionist answered warmly. "Good afternoon. My name is Alicia Harper. I need to schedule a consultation." "Certainly. What is the matter regarding?" I hesitated, then answered with complete honesty. "Forgery." There was a brief silence. "Can you come in tomorrow morning?" "Yes. I'll reserve an hour. It may take longer." The receptionist smiled softly. "We'll make time." The following morning, I carried 3 boxes into Rebecca Lawson's office. The forged sale documents, Dad's handwritten notes, William Bennett's draft agreement. Rebecca greeted me with a firm handshake. She appeared to be in her early 50s, calm, organized. Nothing about her suggested drama, only confidence. "I've reviewed thousands of property disputes," she said after we sat down, "but every case begins the same way." "How?" "With the facts." I appreciated that answer. Not assumptions, not emotions, facts. She listened without interrupting as I explained everything from beginning to end. Dad's promise on the porch, the surveyors, Daniel's phone call, the forged signature, the hidden loans, William Bennett's discovery. When I finished, she quietly organized the documents into separate stacks. Then she asked her first question. "Have you ever signed anything authorizing your brother to act on your behalf?" "No." "Power of attorney?" "Never." "Any blank documents?" "No." She nodded. "Good." Her second question surprised me. "When was the last time you personally saw the original deed?" "I don't remember." "That's all right." She made another note. "We'll obtain it." For nearly 20 minutes, she studied every page William Bennett had provided. She paid particular attention to Dad's handwritten notes. Finally, she looked up. "Your father wasn't a lawyer." I smiled sadly. "No, but he understood something many lawyers spend years explaining." "What?" "Shared ownership means shared authority." She tapped the draft agreement. "This wasn't legally executed." "I know, but..." She lifted the handwritten notes. "These may become very important in establishing his intent." Intent, another new word. Rebecca explained carefully. Courts often examine what someone intended when documents become disputed. I nodded. "So Dad's notes matter?" "They certainly can." She reached for the forged transfer paperwork. "Now let's discuss this signature." I watched silently as she compared it with older documents bearing my genuine signature. Tax filings, insurance forms, bank records. The differences became more obvious every time she placed another page beside it. Finally, she leaned back. "I can't officially call it a forgery." "Why not?" "Because I'm not a handwriting expert." She smiled slightly. "But," she slid the papers back toward me, "I'd be very surprised if one didn't have serious concerns." For the first time since all of this began, I felt someone truly believed me, not because she trusted my story, because she trusted the evidence. Rebecca called someone while I sat quietly across the desk. Daniel? No, a different Daniel. Daniel Foster, forensic document analyst, not the accountant from another case. This Daniel specialized in handwriting analysis. She explained only the basics. When she hung up, she smiled. He can see us Friday. 3 days. I had waited weeks for someone to take the forged signature seriously. Now things were finally moving. Before I left, Rebecca handed me a checklist. Request certified property records, preserve original documents, avoid discussing the case with Daniel, do not surrender any paperwork, document every conversation. Everything looked methodical, organized, practical, exactly what I needed. As I reached the door, Rebecca stopped me. Alicia. Yes? I want to prepare you for something. I turned back. If your brother forged your signature, she spoke gently, the property sale may become only one part of this case. What do you mean? We'll examine financial records, closing statements, loan applications, bank transfers. She paused. Fraud usually doesn't exist in isolation. The words settled heavily in my mind. I had been focused entirely on the farm. Rebecca was looking at something much larger. Driving home, I passed the entrance to our property. The survey stakes still stood in the fields, bright orange against green grass. For the first time, they no longer represented defeat, they represented evidence. Someone had tried to erase my father's wishes with forged ink and hidden paperwork. Now, every document, every signature, every financial record would have to answer the same simple question. If everything was legitimate, why did anyone need to write my name for me? Somewhere beyond those orange stakes, the truth was waiting, not buried beneath the soil Dad loved, buried inside files that someone never expected another set of eyes to examine. And this time, I wasn't searching alone. Friday arrived with a heavy summer rain, the kind Dad used to call slow blessing rain. He loved storms that soaked the fields without washing away the topsoil. As I drove toward Rebecca Lawson's office, I caught myself remembering mornings when Dad and I watched storms roll across the western pasture from the farmhouse porch. He always smiled when the rain came gently. Good things don't always arrive loudly. He would sip his coffee and watch the clouds. Sometimes they show up quietly. I didn't realize it then, but William Bennett's forgotten file had arrived exactly the same way, quietly. Rebecca greeted me with a folder already waiting on the conference table. We're expecting Dr. Daniel Foster any minute. A knock came almost immediately. The man who entered looked to be around 60, silver gray hair, thin wire-rimmed glasses, calm blue-gray eyes that seemed to notice everything. He carried only a leather briefcase, no dramatic equipment, no magnifying glass like television detectives, just years of experience. Rebecca introduced us. Dr. Foster specializes in forensic document examination. He smiled warmly. I'm sorry we have to meet under these circumstances. So am I. He sat beside the stack of documents and carefully removed a pair of cotton gloves. That small detail caught my attention. He treated paper the way surgeons treated patients, with respect. Rebecca handed him 2 folders. One contained my verified signatures from previous years. The other contained the property transfer documents. I'd like an initial opinion, she said. Nothing formal today. He nodded. I understand. For nearly 30 minutes, nobody spoke. Dr. Foster examined every signature through a magnifying loupe. He measured letter spacing, compared pen pressure, studied slant angles, even the pauses where ink naturally became slightly darker. Watching him work felt strangely reassuring. There was no guessing, only observation. Finally, he removed the loop. Then he quietly placed both folders side by side. Alicia. Yes? He needed to ask something. Go ahead. Did you intentionally change your signature over the years? No. Have you ever practiced signing differently? Never. He nodded slowly. I thought so. Rebecca leaned forward. What stands out? Dr. Foster pointed toward the forged signature. Several things, he spoke carefully. As people signed their own names repeatedly over decades, he traced a line with his pen. They develop unconscious habits, natural rhythm, stroke order, pressure, speed. He looked toward me. Those habits become remarkably difficult for someone else to imitate. He placed one of my genuine signatures beside the forged one. At first glance, he admitted, this imitation appears competent. My stomach tightened. But, he smiled faintly, it tries too hard. Rebecca raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? The person copying Alicia's signature appears to have focused on appearance. He pointed toward the long underline. They copied what the signature looked like. Then he pointed toward one of my authentic signatures. They failed to copy how it was created. I watched as he demonstrated. My genuine signature flowed naturally. The forged version contained tiny hesitations, small stops, minute corrections, barely visible, yet once he explained them, I couldn't unsee them. It resembles someone tracing from memory, he concluded, not someone writing instinctively. Rebecca asked quietly, preliminary opinion. He folded his hands. I see multiple indicators consistent with simulation. She nodded. In plain English, I believe someone attempted to reproduce Alicia's signature. The room fell silent. Those words mattered, not because they proved everything, because they confirmed I wasn't imagining it. Rebecca thanked him, then opened another folder. There may be more. Dr. Foster looked surprised. What else? She slid loan documents across the table. I frowned. What are those? Rebecca looked at me. Documents related to the $80,000 equipment loan. Daniel's loan, the one he'd reluctantly admitted. Dr. Foster examined the paperwork. A few moments later, he stopped. Rebecca immediately noticed. What? There are additional signatures. My brother's? No. He looked directly at me. Yours. My name appears there? Rebecca quietly nodded, as co-owner guaranteeing the debt. I stared at the pages. I'd never seen them before, never signed them, never even knew the loan existed. Dr. Foster compared those signatures with the others. His expression became increasingly serious. After a few minutes, he spoke again. They appear to have been produced by the same writer. Rebecca remained silent. So, he continued carefully, if my preliminary opinion holds after laboratory examination, he looked directly at me. This may not be one forged signature. My heart pounded. How many? He counted quietly. 1, 2, 3, then looked up. At least 4. 4. Not one mistake, not one desperate decision. 4 separate documents, 4 different opportunities to stop, 4 deliberate choices. Rebecca slowly closed the folder. This changes things. How? I asked. She answered honestly. A pattern. The word echoed inside my mind. Pattern. 1 forged signature could be explained away. 4 became much harder. Before leaving, Dr. Foster carefully repacked every document. I'll need several days. No rush, Rebecca answered. I'd rather have certainty. So would I. As he reached the doorway, he turned back. Alicia. Yes? I've testified in court for nearly 30 years. I waited quietly. I don't choose sides. I understand. My job is simply to follow the evidence. He smiled gently. And sometimes he looked toward the forged paperwork. The evidence begins speaking long before anyone enters a courtroom. After he left, Rebecca looked at me. I need to prepare you. For what? If these signatures are confirmed as forged, she paused, we'll likely subpoena financial records connected to the sale. The sale money? Yes, and the loan proceeds. She organized another stack of papers. I want to know exactly where every dollar went. I thought back to Karen's constant talk about expansion, new equipment, larger operations, dreams that never seemed to match the farm's actual income. For the first time, I wondered whether the sale had truly been about saving the farm or saving something else entirely. As I drove home, rain finally stopped. Sunlight broke through the clouds, shining across the familiar fields. The orange survey stakes still stood where strangers had placed them, only now I saw something different. Those markers no longer represented the end of my father's legacy. They marked the place where the truth had finally begun to surface. And if 4 forged signatures were only the beginning, I had a feeling the harvest awaiting ahead wouldn't be measured in acres. It would be measured in secrets no one expected to grow into evidence.
The waiting became the hardest part, not because nothing was happening, because so much was happening behind closed doors. Rebecca warned me that legal investigations rarely move as quickly as emotions. Evidence takes time, she reminded me during one of our phone calls. If we rush, she paused, we give the other side opportunities to create doubt. So I waited. Some mornings I drove past the farm without stopping. Construction flags still dotted the fields. The survey markers remained in place. Every time I saw them, I remembered Dad walking those same property lines with Daniel and me when we were children. He knew every fence post, every creek, every tree struck by lightning. He could stand almost anywhere on the farm and tell you a story about that exact spot. Near the north pasture, he taught Daniel to drive the old tractor. Beside the red barn, he taught me how to balance the farm ledger. At the western maple, he taught both of us that a promise carried more value than a handshake if your heart wasn't behind it. Those memories hurt, not because they were gone, because someone had treated them like numbers on a closing statement. One Tuesday afternoon, Rebecca called. We received the preliminary banking records. I immediately sat up. What did they show? They answered one question. And? The $420,000 didn't stay in one account. It didn't? No. I heard papers turning on her desk. Within 48 hours of closing, she continued, large transfers were made to multiple destinations. Daniel's accounts? Some. What about the rest? She grew quiet. Business debts, the equipment loan, several personal credit lines. I closed my eyes. So the sale money was already being spent before I even knew the farm had been sold. Rebecca spoke gently. Alicia. Yes? I know this is difficult. I just keep thinking about Dad. So do I. Her voice softened. I don't believe he would have been angry. What do you think he would have been? She didn't hesitate. Heartbroken. That single word stayed with me long after the call ended. Not angry. Heartbroken. There was a difference. Dad always believed people deserved the chance to correct their mistakes, but he also believed mistakes had consequences. 3 days later, I met Rebecca in person. Stacks of financial records covered her conference table. Bank statements, wire transfer confirmations, loan payoff summaries, canceled checks. She slid one page toward me. Look here. I studied the transaction history. The escrow account entered. Then, money began disappearing. $100,000, $75,000, $40,000, $30,000. Each transfer happened within days. None of this came to me, I whispered. Rebecca nodded. No, not one payment? Correct. What about the $210,000 Daniel claimed he set aside? She opened another folder. We're trying to locate it. Trying? It isn't where he said it was. That sentence chilled me. So he lied again. I'm saying, she chose her words carefully, we haven't found evidence supporting his statement. Facts. Always facts. Never assumptions. I appreciated that about Rebecca. Then she reached for another document. This arrived yesterday. Across the top was the name of the title company that handled the closing. What is it? The closing attendance log. I scanned the page. Buyers, real estate agent, closing attorney, notary, Daniel. Then, my name, signed beside a time I knew I had been at Emma's graduation. Rebecca pointed to the signature. Notice anything? I never wrote it. She knew. She pointed lower. The witness signature. I frowned. What about it? The same witness appears on the loan documents. I looked again. The names matched perfectly. So? Rebecca leaned back. If one witness observed multiple forged signatures, she paused, that witness becomes very important. The realization hit me instantly. Someone else had been present. Someone had watched those documents become official. Whether knowingly or unknowingly, another piece of the truth existed. Later that afternoon, I drove to the cemetery. Dad's grave overlooked the western edge of the farm, exactly as he'd wanted. The maple tree cast long shadows across the grass. I knelt beside the headstone. I wish you were here. The words escaped before I realized I was speaking aloud. I don't know what to do anymore. Wind rustled through the leaves above me. For several minutes, I simply sat there. Then I remembered something Dad used to tell me whenever farm problems seemed impossible. You don't solve an entire harvest, he'd smile. You harvest one row at a time. I laughed softly through tears. Maybe that was exactly what Rebecca was doing. One document, one signature, one bank transfer, one witness, one truth at a time. As I stood to leave, my phone rang. It was William Bennett. Alicia. Hello? I hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all. I found another notebook. Another one? It was tucked behind an old estate ledger. My heart began racing. Does it mention the farm? It does. What does it say? He sighed quietly. I think, he paused, your father suspected someone might someday try to pressure Daniel financially. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. He wrote that? Yes. And Alicia, his voice grew even more serious. There's a name mentioned several times. A name? Karen. I closed my eyes. Everything suddenly felt connected. The loans, the expansion plans, the urgency to sell, the hidden transfers. Karen had always pushed for bigger equipment, more land, more debt. Had Dad seen warning signs long before any of us did? William continued, I'd rather you read it yourself. When can I come? Tomorrow morning. After the call ended, I looked back toward Dad's grave. The setting sun painted the fields in shades of gold, just like the evening he asked Daniel and me to make our promise. Back then, I thought protecting the farm meant defending it from droughts, storms, and failing crops. I never imagined the greatest threat would come from inside our own family, or that my father, somehow, had quietly left behind another piece of the truth, waiting patiently for the day his daughter would need it most.
William Bennett was already waiting when I arrived. The old attorney looked as though he hadn't slept much. A spiral notebook rested on his desk beside 2 steaming cups of coffee. I almost missed this one, he admitted quietly. It had fallen behind an old filing cabinet. I sat across from him. What is it? He gently turned the notebook toward me. It belonged to your father. Unlike the loose handwritten pages he'd shown me before, this notebook looked well used. The edges were worn. Several pages were folded at the corners. Dad had always carried small notebooks in his shirt pocket. Whenever something needed remembering, he wrote it down. Rainfall totals, equipment repairs, feed deliveries, phone numbers. Apparently, he also wrote down his concerns. Mr. Bennett opened to a page marked with a faded paper clip. "I think you should read this yourself." I lowered my eyes. The handwriting was unmistakably Dad's. "Daniel worries me lately, not because he's a bad man, because he's becoming a desperate one. Desperate people sometimes convince themselves that wrong choices are temporary." My throat tightened. The next paragraph mentioned Karen. "Karen dreams bigger than this farm can safely support. I admire ambition, but debt has a way of turning dreams into pressure. I pray Daniel never mistakes urgency for wisdom." I stopped reading for a moment. Dad hadn't disliked Karen. He simply saw something none of us fully appreciated. Pressure. Always pressure. Another page followed. "If either child ever feels cornered financially, the answer must never be selling behind the other's back. Agreement only matters when both people are truly free to choose." Tears blurred the ink. It felt as though Dad had somehow written these pages knowing I would someday need them. William folded his hands. "Your father often talked while I made notes." He smiled sadly. "But these," he looked at the notebook, "he wrote entirely for himself." I carefully closed it. "Can we use this?" He answered honestly, "It may not prove fraud by itself." I understand, but it strengthens the picture. Another piece, another row of the harvest, just as Dad used to say. Later that afternoon, Rebecca called me into her office. When I arrived, Daniel Foster was already there. Several enlarged photographs of signatures covered the conference table. He greeted me warmly. I finished my examination. My heart raced. Rebecca looked at him. "Go ahead." He adjusted his glasses. I compared every questioned signature against more than 40 verified examples of Alicia's handwriting. He opened a formal report. The differences are consistent. He turned another page. Pen movement, stroke sequence, letter formation, natural rhythm. Everything pointed in the same direction. Finally, he looked directly at me. "My professional opinion," he paused, "is that your signatures on the property transfer documents were not written by you." I closed my eyes. Even though I'd known from the beginning, hearing an expert confirm it made everything real. Daniel continued. "The signatures on the loan guarantee documents were also produced by the same unknown writer." Rebecca nodded. "So we now have multiple forged documents connected to both the sale and the loan." "Correct." I asked quietly, "How certain are you?" He answered without hesitation, "To a reasonable degree of professional certainty." Rebecca smiled slightly. "That's exactly the language we needed." She turned toward me. "This changes the case significantly." "How?" She said we're no longer arguing about a family disagreement. She placed the report beside Dad's notebook. "We're presenting evidence of a fraudulent transaction." Before I could respond, her assistant knocked gently. "Rebecca." "Yes?" The title company returned our request. She handed over another envelope. Rebecca opened it immediately. Inside were photocopies of identification documents presented at closing. She frowned. "What is it?" She slid one page across the table. "This driver's license." I looked down. For a moment I didn't understand. Then my stomach dropped. It carried my name, my date of birth, but the photograph wasn't me. Someone had used fraudulent identification during the closing. Daniel Foster leaned closer. "This explains something." "What?" I wondered how the notarization occurred. Rebecca slowly nodded. "If someone appeared pretending to be Alicia," she looked toward me, "the notary may have believed she witnessed a legitimate signing." The room became completely silent. This wasn't simply a forged signature anymore. Someone had allegedly impersonated me. Rebecca reached for the phone. "I need to contact the investigators immediately." While she stepped into the hallway, I sat motionless. Daniel quietly packed away his examination materials. After a few moments, he spoke. "I've testified in hundreds of cases." I looked up. "Very few begin with one forged signature." He paused. "They usually reveal much more." Rebecca returned a few minutes later. "The county investigator wants to meet tomorrow." "So soon?" "Yes." She smiled gently. Once identity fraud addressed the picture, she tapped the fake driver's license. Things move faster. Driving home, my thoughts refused to slow down. Someone hadn't merely signed my name. Someone had allegedly created an identity to replace me. Long enough to sell my father's farm. Long enough to convince strangers that I willingly gave away everything Dad asked us to protect. That evening, Emma stopped by unexpectedly. She immediately noticed the stack of folders covering my dining room table. "Mom?" I smiled weakly. "Hi, sweetheart." She walked over and wrapped her arms around me. "I heard from Aunt Margaret." I sighed. "So everyone knows." "Most of them." She looked into my eyes. "Do you know?" "No?" "Know that none of this changes who Grandpa believed you were." The tears came before I could stop them. Emma hugged me tighter. "He trusted you," she whispered. "And from everything you've shown me," she looked at Dad's notebook resting beside my coffee cup, "he left enough truth behind to prove it." I glanced at Dad's notebook, then toward the window overlooking the fields beyond town. Dad once told me that land remembers promises. Maybe he was right, because every forgotten note, every overlooked file, every inconsistency hidden inside old paperwork seemed determined to remember the promise my brother had chosen to forget. And tomorrow, for the first time, someone with authority to investigate would finally start asking the same questions I had been asking since strangers first appeared carrying survey stakes across our family's land. The county investigator introduced himself as Michael Harris. He wasn't what I expected. No dramatic entrance, no raised voice, no promises that everything would be fixed. He simply carried a legal pad, a laptop, and an expression that suggested he had spent years separating facts from emotions. Rebecca greeted him first. "Thank you for coming." He nodded politely. "I've reviewed the preliminary documents." Then he turned toward me. "Mrs. Harper, I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances." "I am too." He sat across from us and opened a thin file. "I'd like to hear everything in your own words." For nearly an hour, I told the story again. Dad's promise, the surveyors, Daniel's phone call, the forged signature, William Bennett's forgotten files, the handwriting report, the fake driver's license. Michael interrupted only to clarify dates and names. When I finished, he quietly closed his notebook. "You've kept excellent records." Rebecca smiled. She learned from her father. I couldn't help smiling too. Dad believed writing things down prevented confusion. Apparently, it also helped uncover fraud. Michael laid several photographs across the conference table. They came from the title company. I recognized the closing room immediately. A long oak table, leather chairs, a framed landscape on the wall. One photograph showed Daniel signing paperwork. Another showed the buyers. Then he slid the final photograph toward me. There. A woman sat beside Daniel. She wore sunglasses pushed onto her head and kept her face angled slightly away from the camera. Even so, she clearly wasn't me. I stared at the image. "Who is she?" "We're working on that," Michael answered calmly. "But she presented identification using your name." Rebecca folded her arms. "So someone impersonated Alicia during closing." It appears so. I felt cold. Someone had looked strangers in the eyes, used my name, and signed away half of my father's legacy. Michael continued, "The title company employees have already been interviewed. What did they say? They believed the identification was genuine, so they didn't know." "No," he shook his head. "At least there's no indication they knowingly participated." Rebecca nodded thoughtfully. "That matches what we've seen." Michael reached for another folder. "We also subpoenaed financial records connected to the sale proceeds." I leaned forward. "Did you find the money?" "Most of it." He spread several bank statements across the table. The money had moved quickly. Escrow, Daniel's account, loan payoff, equipment financing, credit cards, business debts. Then one transfer caught my attention. $45,000. "What's that one?" Michael checked his notes. "Transferred into a newly opened account." "In Daniel's name?" He looked at me. "No." My heartbeat quickened. "Karen's." Silence filled the room. Rebecca slowly looked up from the paperwork. "So Karen received sale proceeds directly?" Michael nodded. "It appears that way." I remembered every conversation she'd ever had about expanding the farm, buying more equipment, taking bigger risks. Every conversation suddenly carried a different meaning. Rebecca asked another question. "When was the account opened?" Michael flipped another page. 6 days before the sale." She exchanged a quiet glance with me. That wasn't coincidence. Planning had begun before the sale was finalized, maybe even before the forged documents existed. Michael carefully organized the papers again. "We're not reaching conclusions," he reminded us, "but the timeline deserves attention." Facts. Always facts. The facts were becoming impossible to ignore. After the meeting ended, Rebecca walked me toward the elevator. "How are you holding up?" I thought about the question. "I'm sad." She nodded, "but not surprised anymore." "I know." She smiled gently. "Sometimes the evidence reaches a point where it stops shocking you. It just explains things." Exactly. For weeks I had been asking why. Now the documents were quietly answering. That afternoon I drove past Daniel's house. His truck sat in the driveway, so did Karen's SUV. For a moment I considered stopping, then I kept driving. There was nothing left to argue about. Arguments belong to opinions. This case belonged to evidence. Later that evening, Aunt Margaret called. "I need to tell you something." "What is it?" "I didn't want to get involved." "I understand." "But Karen," she hesitated, "visited me before the sale." "What?" "She asked whether your father ever mentioned changing his will." I frowned. "When?" "Almost a year before the property sold." "What did you tell her?" "The truth," Aunt Margaret answered firmly. "Your father always said both children would decide together." I closed my eyes. "Did she seem disappointed?" "Very." Another piece of the puzzle quietly settled into place. Karen hadn't simply hoped for a sale. She apparently been searching for a way around Daniel's wishes long before he passed away, before the forged documents existed. Before hanging up, Aunt Margaret said something I never forgot. "Your father trusted both of you equally." "I know." "No," she corrected, slightly. I frowned. "What do you mean?" "He trusted Daniel to work the land," she paused, "and he trusted you to protect it." After the call ended, I sat on my porch watching the sun disappear behind the distant fields. For the first time, I understood why Dad spent so much time teaching me paperwork instead of tractors. He wasn't preparing me for office work. He was preparing someone to recognize when a document no longer told the truth. The forged signature, the fake identification, the hidden transfers, the newly opened bank account. None of it erased my father's legacy. It simply revealed how many people had underestimated the daughter he trusted to defend it. And somewhere beyond the stacks of financial records and legal filings, I sensed the moment of truth was getting closer. Because lies can survive conversations. They can even survive families. But they rarely survive documents that all begin telling the same story. The courthouse looked smaller than I remembered. Maybe because I wasn't arriving as someone searching for answers anymore. I was arriving with evidence. Rebecca met me outside the courtroom carrying 2 thick binders. One read property records, the other read financial evidence. She smiled reassuringly. Ready? I looked toward the courthouse steps. I don't know. That's an honest answer. She rested a hand lightly on my shoulder. You don't have to be fearless. You only have to tell the truth. Those words stayed with me as we walked inside. The hearing wasn't a full trial, not yet. Today's purpose was determining whether there was enough evidence to invalidate the property transfer while the larger fraud investigation continued. Even so, the courtroom felt heavy. Daniel sat at the opposite table. Karen sat 1 row behind him. For the first time since all of this began, neither of them looked confident. Daniel avoided looking at me. Karen kept whispering to their attorney. I wondered if either of them remembered Dad's porch, the promise, the sunset, or whether $420,000 had buried those memories beneath bank statements and loan payments. The judge entered, everyone stood, then sat. Rebecca began quietly. This case is not about a disagreement between siblings. She walked toward the evidence table. It is about whether one co-owner's legal rights were intentionally taken through forged documents. No drama, no anger, only facts. She called Daniel Foster first. He explained handwriting analysis with remarkable patience. He enlarged my genuine signatures on a screen beside the forged ones. He pointed out stroke order, natural pen lifts, pressure patterns. The courtroom watched silently. Finally, Rebecca asked the question everyone expected. In your professional opinion, she paused, were these signatures written by Alicia Harper? No. Were they written by the same unidentified individual? Yes. To a reasonable degree of professional certainty? They were. Daniel's attorney cross-examined him. Is handwriting analysis infallible? No. Dr. Foster answered honestly. No forensic discipline is. So you could be mistaken. I could. He nodded calmly. But nothing I observed supports that conclusion. His confidence never sounded arrogant, only careful. Next came the county investigator. Michael Harris presented timelines, certified property records, closing attendance logs, the fraudulent identification used during the closing, bank transfers. Every document fit neatly beside the previous one. No single piece proved everything. Together, they painted a picture that became increasingly difficult to ignore. Then Rebecca called William Bennett. Watching Dad's retired attorney take the witness stand filled me with unexpected emotion. He carried the old manila envelope carefully, almost reverently. Rebecca asked him one simple question. Did Robert Harper ever discuss how he wanted ownership decisions handled after his death? William smiled sadly. He discussed it many times. And what did he tell you? He unfolded Dad's handwritten notes. He wanted both children to approve any sale. Why? Because, William looked toward me briefly before returning his attention to the judge, because shared inheritance required shared consent. Rebecca introduced Dad's notebook, the handwritten pages, the unsigned draft agreement. None of them replaced legal ownership documents, but they clearly established Dad's intentions. Daniel's attorney objected repeatedly. Hearsay, speculation, intent. The judge allowed portions into evidence for the limited purpose of understanding the history surrounding the estate planning. That alone mattered. Dad's voice had finally entered the courtroom, not through memory, through ink. Then Daniel testified. He looked exhausted, older than he had only weeks earlier. His attorney asked gentle questions first. Did you believe your sister wanted to sell? I believed she'd eventually agree. Rebecca stood immediately. Eventually, she repeated. So she had not agreed when you signed the closing documents? Daniel hesitated. Yes or no? No. Silence filled the room. Rebecca continued. Did you ever personally watch Alicia sign the transfer documents? No. Did you watch her present identification at closing? Another pause. No. The courtroom remained completely still. Rebecca picked up the forged deed. Then how did you tell family members Alicia approved the sale? Daniel stared at the table. I thought, he swallowed hard, it would be easier once everything was finished. Easier for whom? He didn't answer. Rebecca waited. Easier for the buyers? Silence. Easier for your sister? Nothing. Finally, easier for me. The words barely rose above a whisper. Rebecca nodded once. No further questions. I looked at my brother, not with anger, with sadness, because I finally understood something. Daniel hadn't started by trying to steal my inheritance. He started by trying to solve one financial problem, then another, until every dishonest decision required a larger one to protect it. Debt became secrecy, secrecy became deception, deception became forgery, forgery became the sale of our father's legacy. When testimony ended, the judge reviewed the evidence quietly. The courtroom waited. No one spoke. Finally, the judge looked up. The evidence presented raises substantial questions regarding the validity of the transfer. My heart pounded. He continued, the court finds sufficient cause to suspend recognition of the disputed ownership transfer pending final adjudication. The buyers shifted uncomfortably. Daniel lowered his head. Karen closed her eyes. The judge wasn't finished. Further, he looked directly toward both legal teams. The matter shall be referred for continued investigation regarding alleged forgery, fraudulent identification, and related financial transactions. The gavel struck once. Not loudly, just once, yet the sound echoed through the courtroom. Outside, reporters waited near the courthouse entrance. Rebecca quietly guided me through a side exit. You don't owe anyone a statement, she reminded me. I know. As we walked toward the parking lot, I looked back at the courthouse. For weeks, I feared no one would believe me. Now, a judge had officially recognized that something was deeply wrong. The farm wasn't back yet. The legal battle wasn't over yet, but my father's promise had finally been heard by people with authority to protect it. And for the first time since strangers arrived carrying survey stakes across our land, the future no longer belonged to forged signatures. It belonged to the truth.
The weeks following the judge's ruling felt strangely different. Not easier, just clearer. For months, every morning had begun with uncertainty. Now each day brought another verified fact, another document, another answer. Rebecca called often, sometimes with good news, sometimes simply to explain another step in the legal process. One afternoon, she invited me to her office. When I arrived, several folders sat neatly arranged across the conference table. "You're going to want to see these," she said quietly. I took the chair across from her. "What happened?" The buyers. My heart skipped. What about them? They've agreed to cooperate. I frowned. I thought they'd fight. So did we. She slid a signed statement toward me, but once they learned about the forged signatures, she shrugged gently. Their position changed. I read the first page carefully. The buyers explained that they believed the transaction had been completely legitimate. They described meeting Daniel, meeting the woman who claimed to be me, reviewing identification, signing closing papers, paying the agreed purchase price. Everything appeared normal until investigators contacted them. They were victims too, I whispered. Rebecca nodded. They purchased property they believed was legally available. I closed the statement. I've been so angry. I know. But not everyone involved created this situation. She was right. The buyers hadn't betrayed my father. They had trusted paperwork that turned out to be false. That realization softened something inside me, not toward Daniel, toward everyone else caught in the middle. A few days later, Michael Harris called. We completed another financial review. What did you find? The money. More transfers? Yes. He paused. And something else. I waited quietly. Several payments were made directly toward overdue business obligations. The equipment loans, among others. So the sale wasn't creating something new. No. His voice remained calm. It appears much of the money was used preventing existing financial problems from becoming public. That sentence stayed with me. The farm hadn't been sold to build a better future. It had been sold to hide a failing present. Later that week, I received an unexpected visitor. Daniel. He stood alone on my front porch. No attorney, no Karen, just my older brother. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he asked, "Can I come in?" I looked at him. The man standing there hardly resembled the confident brother who insisted everything would work out. His shoulders sagged, dark circles rested beneath his eyes. He looked tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. I stepped aside. He entered quietly. We sat at the same kitchen table where Dad once taught us how to balance farm expenses. Neither of us reached for coffee. Neither of us pretended this was an ordinary visit. Daniel spoke first. I've replayed that night on the porch 1,000 times. I knew exactly which night he meant. The promise. I remember every word Dad said. So do I. He nodded slowly. I kept telling myself, he stared down at his hands, that I'd fix everything after the sale. I didn't interrupt. I thought I'd pay off the loans, replace your share, buy another farm someday. He laughed bitterly. I created so many plans that I stopped seeing what I was actually doing. I answered quietly. You weren't replacing land. I know. You were replacing Dad's trust. His eyes filled with tears. I know. For the first time since this nightmare began, he didn't defend himself. He didn't explain. He simply accepted the truth. I'm sorry, he whispered. I don't expect forgiveness. You shouldn't. He nodded. I just needed you to know, his voice broke, that every day since this started, I realized I wasn't protecting my family. He looked around the kitchen. I was destroying it. Silence settled between us. Long, heavy, necessary. Finally, I spoke. I've asked myself one question every day. What? Why didn't you come to me? He closed his eyes. Because I was ashamed. Before the sale? Before everything, he admitted. I borrowed money without telling you. Then I needed more. Then I lied. After that, he looked at me with heartbreaking honesty. Every lie demanded another one. Exactly as Rebecca had predicted. Fraud rarely existed alone. It grew, piece by piece, until the truth seemed impossible to reach. Daniel stood to leave. At the front door, he stopped. I don't know if we'll ever be brother and sister again. I answered honestly. I don't know either. He nodded. But I hope someday. He couldn't finish. Neither could I. After he left, I walked outside. The evening sun stretched across the fields beyond my house. For months, I imagined justice would feel like celebration. It didn't. It felt like grief, because winning a legal case couldn't restore 20 years of trust. It couldn't erase forged signatures. It couldn't give Dad the peaceful legacy he deserved. The phone rang just as I returned inside. It was Rebecca. I have news. What kind? The court scheduled the final hearing. My heartbeat quickened. When? Next Thursday. I looked toward the family photograph hanging in my hallway. Dad stood between Daniel and me, one hand resting on each of our shoulders, all three of us smiling. I'll be there, I said quietly. After we ended the call, I stood before that photograph for a long time. The picture captured a family that believed promises lasted forever. Life had taught me otherwise. Promises only survive when people choose them every day. My father had chosen his. I had chosen mine. Now, the court would decide what happened to the land. But no matter what ruling came next, one truth could never be taken away again. I had defended the legacy Dad trusted me to protect, and this time, no forged signature could ever rewrite that story.
The final hearing arrived beneath a clear blue sky. Dad always said beautiful mornings could fool you. Don't judge the day by the sunrise, he used to laugh. Wait until sunset. As I walked toward the courthouse beside Rebecca, I thought about those words. This story had begun with a promise made at sunset. Maybe it was fitting that it would finally end beneath another one. The courtroom was quieter than it had been during the earlier hearing. The buyers were present. Daniel sat beside his attorney. Karen stared silently at the table in front of her. No one looked eager to be there. Rebecca leaned toward me. No matter what happens today, she smiled gently. Remember something. What? You already accomplished the most important part. I looked at her. You've proved your father was telling the truth. Those words steadied me. The judge entered. Everyone stood. After reviewing months of testimony, financial records, forensic reports, and legal arguments, he began reading his decision. He summarized the handwriting analysis, the forged signatures, the fraudulent identification presented at closing, the banking records tracing the sale proceeds, William Bennett's testimony, Dad's handwritten notes, the unsigned preservation agreement. Each piece alone had raised questions. Together, they answered them. Finally, the judge looked directly toward both legal teams. The evidence establishes that Alicia Harper never consented to the sale of her ownership interest. I closed my eyes for a brief moment. The signatures attributed to her were determined to be fraudulent. Silence filled the courtroom. The transfer of ownership was therefore executed without the lawful authority required for jointly owned property. Rebecca quietly rested a reassuring hand on my arm. The judge continued. Accordingly, he turned another page, the transfer is declared legally invalid as it relates to Alicia Harper's ownership interest. A tear slipped down my cheek. The farm had already changed hands, equipment had been moved, improvements had begun. Untangling everything would take additional legal proceedings. The judge acknowledged that reality. Because innocent buyers had relied upon fraudulent documents, restoring the property itself would require separate negotiations and civil remedies. But one thing was no longer in doubt. My legal rights had never disappeared. No forged signature had erased them. No lie had replaced them. The judge also ordered financial restitution proceedings and referred the remaining issues for appropriate legal action involving the fraudulent documents. The gavel came down. This matter is concluded. Not every problem was solved, but the truth had finally been recognized. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited again. This time, I stopped, not because I wanted attention, because I wanted one sentence on the record. A reporter stepped forward. "Mrs. Harper, how do you feel after today's ruling?" I thought carefully before answering. This case was never only about land. Pins paused. Cameras remained steady. My father spent his life teaching my brother and I that trust was worth more than money. I smiled sadly. I came here to protect that lesson. Nothing more, nothing less. I thanked them politely and walked away. Rebecca caught up with me near the courthouse steps. "You handled that beautifully." I meant every word. "I know." She looked toward the distant countryside. "So," she smiled, "what will you do now?" I laughed softly. For the first time in a long time, I looked up at the open sky. I'm going to think about tomorrow instead of yesterday. A few weeks later, the buyers contacted me through their attorney. They wanted a conversation, not another argument. A conversation. We met at the farmhouse. For the first time since all this began, I walked through the old front door without feeling anger, only memories. The buyers spoke first. "We're sorry." "You didn't do this," I answered honestly. "You were deceived too." After several meetings, we reached an agreement that protected everyone's legal interests without ignoring the truth of what had happened. It wasn't perfect, real life rarely is, but it respected my ownership rights and acknowledged that the sale should never have occurred the way it did. More importantly, it honored Dad's intentions. Months later, I visited the western pasture alone. The old maple tree still stood proudly over Dad's grave. The evening breeze moved through the fields exactly as it had when he asked Daniel and I for our promise. I knelt beside the headstone. "We did lose some things," I whispered. "Our family changed." I rested my hand against the cool stone. "But your voice didn't disappear." I smiled through quiet tears. "You made sure of that." The forgotten notebook, the unsigned agreement, William Bennett's careful records, each document became another way Dad reached across time to protect the legacy he believed both of his children deserved. As I stood to leave, I looked across the fields one final time. The land hadn't forgotten. Dad was right all along. It remembered every season, every harvest, every promise. And now, so did I. People often think an inheritance is measured in acres, dollars, or deeds filed at the courthouse. My father left me something far greater. He left me the courage to defend what was right, even when I stood alone. He left me the wisdom to value integrity above convenience. He left me the understanding that family names mean nothing very little if they're not carried with honesty. In the end, I recovered more than my legal rights. I recovered my father's true intentions. I recovered my own voice. And I learned that the greatest legacy a parent can leave isn't property. It's raising someone willing to protect the truth when protecting it becomes difficult. Because land can be sold, money can be spent, documents can be forged, but a legacy built on honesty can survive every one of those things. As the sun disappeared behind the fields my family had loved for generations, I finally understood what Dad meant all those years ago. Land remembers promises, and when someone has the courage to defend those promises, the land remembers them forever. The end.